What's on your dinner table tonight? Beef, potatoes, corn, or fresh fruit? Then you should take a closer look. Because while millions of Americans still believe their food supply is secure, a system that's been considered unshakable for generations is collapsing in the background. Within just a few months, four massive agricultural operations have been pushed to the brink of bankruptcy. Dead cattle are floating in flooded pastures, valuable harvests are being destroyed, potato containers are sitting without buyers, and ripe cherries are rotting right on the trees because no one can pick them in time. But natural disasters are only part of the truth. Hidden behind this collapse are debts, lost export markets, rising costs, labor shortages, and political decisions whose consequences could now be felt in every grocery store. While Canada takes over larger and larger shares of the market, prices in the U.S. are climbing, and entire regions are losing control over their food supply. How could four of America's most powerful agricultural businesses be brought down so quickly? And why is Donald Trump's reaction causing even more outrage now? Stick around until the end, because the final case shows just how chillingly quiet the disappearance of an entire agricultural era can be. One King Ranch, Texas. On July 4th, 2025, Texas wasn't celebrating independence. On the flooded pastures of the legendary King Ranch, people were counting dead cattle. Thousands of animals had been swept away by the floodwaters, corn and cotton silos lay destroyed in the mud, and roads and transport routes suddenly ceased to exist. In just a few days, one of the most powerful symbols of American agriculture was transformed into a disaster zone. But the rain alone didn't bring King Ranch down. It was just the final blow to an operation that had already been fighting for its survival. For more than 170 years, the ranch stood for the American cowboy dream. At around 825,000 acres, it was larger than the entire state of Rhode Island. It fed thousands of families, produced millions of pounds of beef annually, and exported to Mexico, Japan, and Europe. However, in early 2025, this empire began to crumble. Japanese and European buyers rejected shipments because import standards and trade conditions had changed. Canada won over new customers, while Mexican buyers walked away as a result of American tariff policies. At the same time, costs for feed, fuel, and loans rose, while insurance and government aid vanished. Then came the heavy rain. For 3 days, water poured over South Texas until rivers overflowed and swallowed large parts of the ranch. The damage was estimated at more than $200 million, but no number captures the families who lost their jobs, or the small businesses that also had to close without shared warehouses and transport centers. Only a few weeks later, the price of beef in Houston rose dramatically. Schools cut red meat from their meals, grocery stores shrunk their packaging, and restaurants increasingly turned to imported goods. A single ranch had fallen, and suddenly the food supply of the entire American South was shaking. And while Texas was still trying to clear the debris, the next agricultural giant was already starting to die in the heart of the Corn Belt. There was no flood there and no storm, only debt, empty accounts, and a terrifying silence. 2. Schultz Family Farms, Iowa. The second collapse happened without a flood or a storm. In Iowa, one of the Corn Belt's most important corn and soybean operations died slowly from debt, rising costs, and lost markets. Schultz Family Farms supplied ethanol plants, feed manufacturers, and customers in Germany, the Netherlands, and Japan. But in 2025, every harvest became a losing venture. Corn was only bringing in about $4.22 per bushel, while production cost around $4.80. At the same time, prices for fertilizer, pesticides, and fuel rose. Interest rates for seasonal loans also reached nearly 9%. Then Europe tightened its standards for genetically modified products. Long-term contracts were canceled, and many buyers switched to Canadian suppliers whose seeds and storage were better documented. Schultz wanted to use new varieties and modernize the infrastructure, but the banks refused further loans. Promised aid didn't arrive in time. When a major harvester failed due to a software glitch, the situation became hopeless. Only an authorized technician was allowed to repair it. The farm waited for days and paid more than $4,000 while further losses mounted. The family tried to sell their harvest directly to consumers. They organized markets, handed out flyers, and advertised on social media. But after European customers walked away, mistrust grew at home too. Even American processors opted for Canadian corn. In the end, the field stayed green, but no one wanted to buy the crop. Parts of the plants were destroyed, machinery sat idle, and Peter Schultz told his partners that the farm could no longer continue planting. The consequences immediately hit livestock operations in Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. Feed became scarce, meat more expensive, and smaller farmers had to reduce their herds. Schultz didn't just lose his business. America lost an important part of its food supply. And while Iowa was still struggling with the fallout, the next agricultural giant in North Dakota was already starting to disappear. 3 R.D. Offutt Farms, North Dakota. The third collapse began without a storm or flood. In North Dakota, the potato fields stood under the sun, the cold storage facilities were running, and the trucks were ready. But the buyers never came. R.D. Offutt Farms was one of the largest potato producers in the U.S. Across more than 60,000 acres, the company supplied fast food chains like McDonald's and Wendy's, as well as markets in Japan, South Korea, Mexico, and Saudi Arabia. For decades, potatoes from North Dakota were considered a symbol of American quality, but in 2025, that trust began to shatter. In Japan, videos spread showing unusual smells and poor French fry quality. Restaurants reported residues and inconsistent shipments. Complaints also piled up in the U.S. about soft, greasy, or strange-tasting fries. International customers looked for a safer alternative and found it right across the border. Producers in Alberta and Manitoba had long since invested in resilient varieties, modern storage technology, and stricter controls. More and more contracts went to Canada. Even American fast food brands suddenly used Canadian potatoes. The logos stayed the same, but the contents on the plates no longer came from the U.S. For Offutt, a quiet catastrophe began. Frozen potato containers sat in Fargo for over 90 days without new export orders. At the same time, electricity costs, storage fees, and interest rates climbed. Offutt wanted to implement new varieties and modernize their technology, but after the credit crunch, the capital was missing. Applications for aid sat idle, warehouses were full, and transport companies shifted their routes toward Canada. The terrifying part was that many consumers hardly noticed the change. They kept eating fries at American chains, but the potatoes were no longer from America. R.D. Offutt didn't just lose customers. The U.S. lost a piece of its food identity. And while North Dakota vanished from the export map, the final farm in this video began to collapse in the West. There, the trees were full of fruit, but no one came to harvest it. Chef 4, Stemmelt Growers, Washington. The final collapse began under perfect conditions. No flood, no frost, no storm. The cherry trees in Washington were full of ripe fruit. But at the exact moment the harvest needed to begin, the most important thing was missing: the people. Stemmelt Growers was one of the largest family-owned fruit producers in the U.S. The company employed about 1,500 permanent staff and exported cherries, apples, pears, and peaches to more than 20 countries. For the Wenatchee region, Stemmelt wasn't just a business. It was part of their identity. In the summer of 2025, however, less than half of the required seasonal workers showed up. Rumors of immigration enforcement checks spread fear. Many workers from California stayed home or avoided the trip to Washington. Even higher wages couldn't solve the problem. Cherries don't wait. Once they are ripe, they must be picked, cooled, and shipped within a very short window. If they stay on the tree too long, they get soft, split open, or begin to rot. Stemmelt tried everything. The harvest was moved to the night, cold storage ran longer, and new methods were supposed to extend shelf life. But costs soared within a few weeks, while revenue plummeted. Then Japan, South Korea, and other international customers canceled their contracts. Shipments arrived too late, and some containers were rejected due to mold. Hundreds of tons of high-quality fruit had to be processed into juice and sold far below production costs. On July 2025, Stemmelt finally filed for bankruptcy as part of a court-ordered restructuring process. There was no big scandal and no dramatic press conference. Only full trees, shut down cold storage, and workers watching as ripe cherries fell untouched to the ground. The Stemmelt case shows how dependent modern agriculture has become on labor and on-time supply chains. When even a successful operation can collapse within a few weeks, The question is no longer which farm will fall next. The real question is, who will feed America in the future? Four large agricultural operations, four different causes, but the same result. America's food supply is losing more and more stability. King Ranch was hit by floods, Schultz family farms by debt, RD Offutt by lost markets, and Stemmelk growers by labor shortages. But their collapse affects far more than just individual regions. When major farms disappear, transport routes, warehouses, feed supplies, and smaller operations also come under pressure. Meat becomes more expensive, packaging gets smaller, and more food has to be imported. The critical question, therefore, is no longer whether American agriculture is in crisis. It's how many more farms have to fall before Washington acts. What do you think? Can America still save its food supply? Write your opinion in the comments and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any further developments.